Stretch your hand out in front of you right now. Palm up, fingers relaxed, not spread apart. Now look closely at two fingers only. Your index finger, the one you use to point, and your ring finger, the one next to your pinky. Compare their length. For a lot of people, those two fingers land almost exactly at the same spot. But for many others, the ring finger clearly stretches past the index finger by a noticeable amount. If that's your hand, you're looking at something scientists spent over 100 years trying to explain. This tiny difference in finger length has a name. Researchers call it the digit ratio, and for most of the 20th century, nobody could agree on what it actually meant. Some scientists thought it was pure, random variation, no different from the shape of your ears or the curl of your hair. Others suspected it had something to do with hormones. A smaller group thought it might be tied to something much older, something buried deep in human ancestry. For decades, none of them had the tools to settle the argument. Then, over the last several years, genetic research finally caught up, and what it uncovered turned out to be far more interesting than anyone expected. The strongest signal wasn't scattered evenly across the globe. It pointed straight at one region in particular, and it's a region most people watching this will instantly recognize. Before we get into the details, if you find this kind of deep dive into the human body interesting, consider subscribing. Videos like this take a lot of research to put together, and it helps a lot when people who enjoy them stick around for the next one. Let's go back to the beginning, though, because this pattern was noticed long before anyone had a microscope or a strand of DNA to study. Ancient physicians and scholars mentioned it in passing writings. Painters during the Renaissance sketched hands with careful attention to finger proportion, sometimes without realizing they were documenting a measurable biological trait. People simply observed that some hands looked balanced, with the ring and index fingers reaching nearly the same point, while other hands showed a clear gap between them. Nobody had a name for it. Nobody had an explanation. It was just something people noticed and wrote down, generation after generation, without knowing it would eventually become a serious subject of genetic research. The scientific study of this trait really picked up pace in the late 1990s. A researcher based in the United Kingdom began systematically measuring finger lengths across thousands of people, spanning different ages and different backgrounds. What he found changed how scientists thought about the trait entirely. The ratio between the index and ring fingers isn't something that develops gradually over childhood or shifts as you age. It's locked in before birth. Somewhere in early fetal development, the proportion gets set, and from that point forward, it barely changes for the rest of a person's life. You can gain weight, lose weight, build muscle, or age decades, and your digit ratio will stay almost exactly where it started. That permanence is part of what makes the trait so valuable to scientists. Most physical traits we can measure are influenced by lifestyle, environment, or timing. Muscle size responds to exercise. Skin tone shifts with sun exposure, but digit ratio doesn't budge. Whatever process shapes it happens once, quietly, in the womb, and then it stays fixed for a lifetime. That makes it something closer to a fossil record hidden in a living body, a permanent snapshot of a very specific window of development. So what actually sets this ratio? The leading explanation involves hormone exposure during a narrow stretch of pregnancy, somewhere around the second and third months of fetal development. During this window, the bones in the fingers are growing at a rapid pace, and that growth appears to respond to the hormonal environment surrounding the fetus. The ring finger seems particularly sensitive to testosterone levels present at that stage. Higher relative testosterone exposure tends to be linked with a ring finger that grows proportionally longer than the index finger. The index finger, on the other hand, appears more responsive to estrogen levels, and higher relative estrogen exposure tends to produce an index finger that matches or slightly exceeds the ring finger in length. This is part of the reason the trait shows a general difference between men and women across most populations. The two sexes tend to experience different average hormone environments before birth, and the hand ends up recording that difference permanently. For a long time, that hormone story was treated as the whole explanation. Full stop. But cracks started to show once researchers began running the same measurements outside of Europe and North America. Teams working in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and other regions kept collecting large samples and comparing the averages, and the averages weren't identical. Every population showed some spread of ratios among individuals, but when you looked at the overall average for each population, small and consistent differences kept appearing. These weren't huge, dramatic gaps you could spot by eye. They were subtle shifts, often just a few hundredths of a point. But the same pattern showed up again and again in study after study across cities, decades, and independent research teams that had no connection to one another. One of the clearest and most consistently repeated findings involved populations with East Asian ancestry. Researchers working in cities across China, Japan, and South Korea, as well as smaller regional studies throughout the broader area, kept landing on a similar result. On average, individuals with East Asian ancestry showed a slightly lower digit ratio than the global average, meaning the ring finger tended to reach a bit further past the index finger than it did in many other populations. Again, this wasn't something you'd notice at a glance in any single hand. It only showed up when scientists pooled large numbers of measurements and ran the statistics. But it was real, and it kept reappearing no matter who ran the study or where they ran it. For a long time, this finding sat in the scientific literature as an unresolved curiosity. Researchers noted it, filed it away, and moved on, because nobody could say with confidence why it existed. Was it truly written into the genes? Was it caused by something environmental, diet, climate, or some other regional factor common across East Asia? Or was it simply a fluke of how different studies measured hands? The question sat unanswered for close to 2 decades, mostly because the tools needed to answer it properly didn't exist yet. That changed with the rise of large-scale genetic research in the 2010s and into the early 2020s. Scientists began running genome-wide association studies, large projects that scan the DNA of tens of thousands of people at once, searching for genetic variants that line up with a specific physical trait. Several research groups built studies specifically aimed at the digit ratio, measuring huge numbers of hands and cross-referencing the results against each participant's genetic data. What emerged from this work was that the digit ratio isn't controlled by a single gene acting like an on-off switch. It's shaped by many small genetic variants working together, each contributing a tiny nudge to the final proportion. This kind of trait is called polygenic, and it's actually the more common pattern for physical characteristics. Height and skin tone work the same way. Within that wide collection of small genetic contributors, though, a specific family of genes kept showing up as unusually influential. These are genes involved in controlling how limbs and digits are laid out during early embryonic development. Ancient genetic machinery shared across a huge range of animal species, responsible for organizing where fingers, toes, and other body segments form, and how quickly the bones inside them grow. Small variations in the regulatory regions surrounding these genes, the parts of DNA that control when and how strongly a gene switches on, rather than the gene itself, appear to be capable of nudging finger growth in one direction or another. A slightly stronger activation in the area that becomes the ring finger, paired with a slightly weaker one in the area that becomes the index finger. And you end up with a hand where the ring finger visibly outgrows its neighbor. Shift the balance the other way, and the fingers land closer to even. These variants aren't rare exotic mutations found only in a handful of people. They're common, spread throughout the global population in different proportions. And that's exactly where things get interesting, because the frequency of these variants isn't the same everywhere in the world. When researchers compared how often the variants linked to a lower digit ratio appeared across different populations, they found real, measurable differences. A particular variant might show up in roughly 1 out of every 6 or 7 people in one population, while appearing in nearly 1 out of every 3 people in another. These aren't traits exclusive to any single group. They show up everywhere on the planet in some proportion, but the odds of carrying them shift noticeably depending on ancestry. And populations with deep East Asian roots consistently showed higher frequencies of several of the variants, most strongly linked to a lower ratio. In other words, the pattern seen in the hand measurements wasn't a coincidence or a measurement error. It was a visible reflection of an underlying genetic distribution that had been there all along, just waiting for the right tools to detect it. That naturally raised a bigger question. Where did these variants actually come from? Were they something new, arising recently within East Asian populations after they split off from other ancestral groups? Or were they much older, carried along from a shared ancestor and simply preserved at higher rates in certain regions over time? To dig into that question, researchers turned to one of the most powerful tools in modern anthropology, ancient DNA. Over roughly the past decade and a half, scientists have gotten increasingly good at extracting and sequencing genetic material from skeletal remains, some of them tens of thousands of years old. This lets researchers compare living populations directly against the ancient people who once lived in the same regions, tracing which genetic variants were already present long before recorded history began. The picture that emerges from combining ancient DNA with modern population genetics points toward deep roots. Several of the key variants linked to a lower digit ratio appear to have existed in the populations that first expanded out of Africa more than 50,000 years ago. They were present among the early modern humans who pushed across the vast interior of Asia and eventually reached its eastern edge tens of thousands of years ago. As different groups spread outward and settled into different regions over an enormous stretch of time, the relative frequency of these variants gradually shifted from place to place. In populations that settled and remained in East Asia across many thousands of generations, several of the variants linked to a lower ratio appear to have become somewhat more common than they did elsewhere. Why exactly this happened is still an open question, and honestly, that's part of what makes this area of research so compelling. It isn't fully settled. Some researchers lean toward genetic drift, which is essentially random chance playing out over enormous timescales. When a population expands into new territory or goes through a period where its numbers are relatively small, the frequency of any given genetic variant can shift up or down simply by chance. The same way flipping a coin 100 times won't always land at exactly 50-50. Other researchers wonder whether subtle selective pressures were involved, possibly connected to climate or other environmental factors during pregnancy, though this remains far less certain and much harder to prove. Most likely, the honest answer is a mix of both forces working together slowly across an almost unimaginable span of time. Whatever combination of forces was responsible, the outcome is what researchers measure today. If you're someone whose ring finger clearly outreaches your index finger, there's a reasonable chance that the genetic variants behind that trait trace back, at least in part, toward populations with deep East Asian ancestry. That doesn't mean the trait is exclusive to that ancestry, though, and this point matters a lot. These variants exist in every population on Earth. Plenty of people with European, African, Indigenous American, or any other ancestral background show a lower digit ratio too. The trait itself is universal. What differs from region to region isn't whether the trait exists, but how frequently the underlying variants appear. That frequency is what tells a story about where certain genetic threads were preserved most strongly across deep human history. And East Asia happens to be one of the regions where that preservation shows up most clearly in the data. It isn't the only one either. Populations across the Pacific Islands, including Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian groups, show patterns consistent with ancestral ties to East and Southeast Asia. Parts of South Asia, shaped by ancient migrations that overlapped with East Asian lineages thousands of years ago, show traces of the same pattern. If your ancestry connects to the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, or Indonesia, there's an added layer to the story because Southeast Asia has historically been a crossroads for multiple waves of ancient migration. Earlier groups of foragers settled the region tens of thousands of years before a later wave, often linked to the spread of early agriculture, moved southward from the Asian mainland through Taiwan and out across the islands. Both waves likely carried some of these digit ratio variants with them, layered together in the genetic makeup of people living in the region today. For people with Korean ancestry, the genetic record shows strong, long-standing continuity with ancient populations that lived on the Korean peninsula for thousands of years. For people with Japanese ancestry, the picture is a little more layered, shaped by the blending of an older population that inhabited the Japanese islands for an extremely long stretch of time, with a later wave of migration from the Asian mainland a few thousand years ago. Smaller genetic surveys of communities with especially deep continuity to that older population have found results consistent with the broader East Asian pattern, suggesting the trait runs through both ancestral branches that eventually combined into the modern population. For people with Chinese ancestry, the history runs deeper still, shaped by distinct northern and southern lineages with their own separate migration histories stretching back thousands of years. Despite those internal differences, both branches share many of the same digit ratio variants, and populations across China have been among the most extensively studied groups in this entire body of research, contributing heavily to the broader pattern researchers keep finding. And if your ancestry is mixed, maybe with one grandparent or great-grandparent from an East Asian background, this trait can sometimes show up as a quiet little signature, even in a hand that doesn't otherwise carry obvious outward traits from that side of the family. To be clear, the digit ratio should never be treated as any kind of ancestry test. It's far too subtle and far too influenced by chance for that. But for people who already know their family history includes East Asian roots, it can serve as a small, quiet physical reminder, written into the body long before birth. Now, it's worth pausing here to clear up some misconceptions, because this trait has been dragged through a lot of exaggerated claims in popular writing over the years. A lower digit ratio isn't a measure of intelligence. It isn't a reliable predictor of athletic ability, despite plenty of pop science claims suggesting otherwise. It has no established connection to personality, career success, or romantic compatibility, regardless of how many casual articles have tried to link it to those things. The serious, peer-reviewed research is far more modest in its claims. What the science actually supports is this. The digit ratio is a developmental marker, shaped in part by hormone exposure before birth, and in part by a wide collection of small genetic variants inherited from your ancestors. It tells you something about the chemistry of the environment you developed in, and something about deep-rooted genetic history. It doesn't tell you anything about your character, your talents, or where your life is headed. Read properly, without the exaggeration, the real finding here is something quieter and, honestly, more interesting than any of the inflated claims. One of the smallest, most overlooked details of the human hand turns out to be a genuine biological record. a record of prenatal development, a record of inherited genetics, and in some cases, a faint echo of migrations that took place tens of thousands of years before anyone alive today was born. It's not a loud trait. Most people go their whole lives without ever thinking about the relative length of their fingers. But once you understand what that small proportion is actually recording, your hand starts to look a little different. It becomes a quiet archive you carry with you everywhere, one that scientists are only now learning to properly read. There's one more piece worth mentioning because it ties the whole picture together. As consumer DNA ancestry testing has become widely available, researchers have started checking whether digit ratio correlates with the ancestry percentages these tests report. Early findings suggest a weak but consistent link. People with a higher percentage of East Asian ancestry, as estimated by these tests, do tend to show slightly lower average digit ratios. That correlation isn't strong enough to mean anything for any one individual, and nobody should try to use it that way. But across large groups, the pattern holds steady, and it lines up with everything the genetic and anthropological research has already suggested. The hand and the DNA are telling the same story, just from two completely different angles. Research in this area is still moving forward. Scientists are looking at how these digit ratio variants interact with other genes involved in early development. They're studying how the variants are distributed across smaller communities within East and Southeast Asia. They're comparing ancient populations that left few or no living descendants against the genetic variants carried by people today, trying to figure out which threads survived and which ones didn't. The hand will likely keep playing a role in that research for a long time, simply because it offers one of the only outwardly visible windows into a developmental process that otherwise happens completely out of sight, hidden inside the body months before birth. If you carry this trait yourself, there's something worth sitting with here. You didn't choose your digit ratio. You didn't choose the genetic variants you inherited, and you certainly didn't choose the long, winding path your ancestors walked across mountains, rivers, and open plains tens of thousands of years before any modern country existed. But the inheritance is real, and it's sitting quietly on your hand right now, exactly as it has been since before you were born, and exactly as it will remain for the rest of your life. A small, silent record of where the long chain of people behind you actually came from, written into a part of the body you've probably looked at almost every single day without ever once wondering what it might be quietly telling you. And there's something worth appreciating in how universal this trait is, even with its regional patterns. These genetic variants exist in every human population on Earth. This trait shows up in every human group everywhere, without exception. What differs from place to place is frequency, not presence. When researchers map digit ratio across the globe, they don't find sharp boundaries separating one population from another. They find a gradual gradient, a slow shift in averages from one region to the next, with massive overlap between every single group along the way. Two random people pulled from any two different populations on Earth are going to be far more alike in their digit ratios than they are different. This is a story told in averages across huge groups of people, not a label that can be slapped onto any individual hand. Every hand out there is carrying the exact same kind of quiet, ancient record. It's just that the details written into each one are slightly different, shaped by a history that stretches back far longer than any of us can really imagine.